Hello, my name's Robert Waller. I'm with Protect Heritage Corp. I'm going to be talking about controller influence in linking risk analysis with risk management. Museums come in a wide range of types and sizes. From here, we see the world's smallest museum in Superior, Arizona. In contrast that with the world's largest museum, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. For very small museums, it's possible to do risk management by a kind of command and control approach. Often there's just a single person in charge of the museum. Sometimes that's even just a volunteer. And typically what will happen is that the museum might contract a preventive conservator to come in, look at the situation, and come up with recommendations, say for improving the protection of fragile objects that might be in vulnerable places to being knocked off and broken, controlling light levels to avoid problems like this military jacket where those dark stripes, one is where it was shaded by a belt, the other diagonal one shaded by a shoulder strap, and you can clearly see the effect of fading on that jacket. And more recently, I guess, protecting paintings from mashed potatoes, tomato soup, and whatnot being thrown on them. But the idea here is that a consultant can provide a set of recommendations for improved risk management for the collections, and then that set of recommendations is adopted as a set of commands that the museum will embark on completing those projects. It's quite different for very large museums. For those museums, the collections can be very diverse. Take, for example, the Canadian Museum of Nature, where I first developed this risk analysis model for protecting cultural property. Our collections range in size from things as small as diatoms, just a few microns across, to dinosaurs many meters across. In materials, we have cellulose-based collections like our pressed plant herbarium. We have many protein-based collections, insects, in fact, all zoology collections. We have special preparations, including microscope slides and some very attractive special preparations, such as gemstones. Now, these diverse collections are subject to many threats and hazards. Whoa, here we see a criminal making off with our gemstone. He left the dried plant and took the gemstone, smart cookie. But those dried plants aren't going to survive that well if there's a major fire, which many museums around the world will experience fires. Typically, there's a major museum fire several times each year. Also, we have insects coming in and eating. They actually, perverse little guys, they like to eat their own kind. Insect collections are among the most vulnerable to attack by insects. And that set of collections just disappeared. We may not know if it was misfiled, put away in the wrong place so we can't find it. Maybe it was taken home for study and not returned. Who knows? It's gone. Now, how do we think about the total risk to a collection? Well, we consider our collection, and here let's take this example of just 25 objects in this collection, and we define our preservation goal as an operational goal that is to carry the collection forward in time by 100 years. Of course, reality is bound to be somewhat different. Here we see two objects have simply disappeared. Maybe they were stolen, misfiled, who knows, but they're gone now. So that's clearly a departure from our goal. And it's these departures from a goal that are defined as risks. A third of the collection was put on permanent exhibit and faded out. While the objects are still there, clearly they've lost some value. And that's then another departure from our goal of maintaining the collection value over 100 years. And finally, there might be just a chance of a rare event causing extreme damage to the collection, in this case, a fire destroying the entire collection. These are the risks. They're departures from what we've defined as our operational goal. We define generic risks as being an agent of change and a type of risk. Agents of change, we recognize 10 that can be quite comprehensive in describing risks. They're physical forces, fire, water, thieves and vandals, pests, like insect pests and vermin, pollutants, light exposure, adverse temperature, adverse relative humidity, and dissociation or loss of data. And we recognize that each agent may occur as one of three types of risk. They can be rare events defined as a frequency of less than 1 in 100 years, represented here by a catastrophic fire, or sporadic incidents, represented here by something being dropped and broken. So these incidents might occur every few years or few decades and involve one or a few items. Finally, progressive continual damage, like the wearing of these genes, is recognized as a type 3 risk. So that leads to generic risks, but there can be a great diversity within each generic risk. Say physical forces type 1 could be a major earthquake, could be a tornado, a sinkhole, a building collapse, many different things. So we describe a number of specific risks to have a comprehensive understanding of each generic risk. And then specific risks are carefully defined clearly so that numbers can be attached to them. And we define them using three parts. What's the source of the hazard? What's the path by which the agent goes from the source to the collection and reaches the collection? And then what's the effect on the collection? We use a risk ranking and screening approach using the hierarchical holographic modeling method proposed by Yakov Ames, and we do this to inform decision makers in complex organizations. Now, this just shows the general results of a risk assessment, in this case in the 1990s to our Canadian Museum of Nature. And here we see that 24 generic risks affecting 19 collection units, and we see the overall picture is really quite complex. So for somebody responsible for preserving this institution's holdings of collections, it's not a simple matter to decide whether any particular risk is of great importance or not. But it's valuable to recognize that the range here is really huge. Our highest risk is about 30%, but they range down to just a part per million, even for these things that were considered plausible risks worth considering whether we need to improve our protection from them. And this tells us that when it comes to measuring risks, we're not so interested in is the risk 0.1234 or 0.1232, but rather is the risk 1 part per 1,000 or 1 part per 10,000 or just a part per million or that sort of thing. That's very helpful. Also helpful is to realize that we don't have to just be stuck with this forest. We can come out of the forest and look at its profile along either of these directions. Here we come out and look at how are the risks distributed by collection unit. And here we see a typical distribution, high at one end and trailing down to 0 at the other. It takes the form of what's known as a Pareto distribution. That's by collection unit. If we come back and look at the forest through the other direction, how are risks distributed by generic risk? We see again, actually, an even more extreme distribution. These are known as Pareto distributions. Now, the classic Pareto distribution is 80-20, or it's the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the risk is associated with just 20% of either the collection units or the generic risk or whatever it is you're measuring. These are very commonly, and this is most commonly what we find. Sometimes we'll find a more extreme distribution, like a 90-10 distribution. Often this is the case where fire is a major risk to a museum collection. Then we might get this kind of distribution. Occasionally, where there's been quite good risk mitigation practices applied in the past, we get down to something that's more like a 70-30 distribution. But what we've never found, after looking at hundreds of collection units in dozens of institutions, we've never encountered something that's like approaching a 50-50 distribution. In this case, we would find that, well, there's really hard to find any cost benefit of further risk mitigation, but this is just not what we find. Now, returning to this distribution, this is helpful for an overall understanding of what's the sources of risk to collections at an institution, but there is no single person that has a handle on all of the levers that control the levels of various risks. So how do we get an institution to effectively and cost-effectively reduce its risks? Let's consider, what can we control and what can we influence? And finally, what do we need to simply accept? Now, it's generally true that as humans, we'd probably want to control everything we possibly can. That way, we don't have to rely on working to influence something, and we don't have to just accept what we don't like. We're in total control. Of course, in reality, this just isn't possible in an organization. Even the chief executive can't control everything. He relies on other people to control what they have expertise in managing. So what happens then if, instead of striving to control as much as possible, we let our control reduce so that then we can actually have more resource, time, effort available to influence outcomes. In that way, we can actually reduce what we need to accept, reduce the effort we need to put into control, and have the best possible influence. There we go. Our influence has increased, acceptance and control reduced. So how can we do that when we have this understanding of risk distribution? And here I'd like to thank the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, who have allowed me to share their information with you. So here we see distribution. This one looks maybe about 70-30. It's because it's considering about 30 different collection units across the whole institution. But who's controlling these risks? This can become really important. So let's look at this distribution and fill it in by who's able to control different generic risks. Collection management, we see, is able to influence the second, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh most significant risks: dissociation, the concentration and levels of fluid preservatives, alcohol water solutions, that is, contaminants and physical forces, and so on. Our conservation function is most able to influence the third, fifth, and seventh most significant risks. That is the light and ultraviolet radiation affecting permanent exhibits is our LUV3 or progressive risk. Contaminants, looking at pollutants that might be emitted from storage materials. It's important for conservation to identify those issues and recommend improved storage methods. And then finally, the LUV2 is light and ultraviolet in temporary exhibits. Very important for conservation to provide advice on how that can be reduced. But now, who is influencing this most significant risk? Temperature type 1. This institution has 2 collection units that are of frozen tissues. The collection managers have very effectively planned emergency preparedness approaches for short-term freezer failures and power outages, things that might last for a day or a couple of days, that sort of thing. But we know that given the fragility of North American power grids, that we have to start considering the possibility in the coming decades of very long-term, broad regional power failures. And for that, the institution is not yet equipped. What's required is a reliable local power generation for backup power for these freezers. And that's really a facility management issue. Facility management has to be able to provide that to protect the collections. Now, we can just resort these so that decision makers in each of these functional areas see how their decisions influence risks to the collections, so they get their own Pareto distributions and can see how they need to focus resources to have the best possible overall effect on collections. Just returning to this range of museum sizes, we've seen that for very small museums, a command and control approach to risk management is reasonable. For very large museums, that just falls apart. There's too many areas of functional responsibility and authority. It requires that we network and provide risk information to each decision maker so that risk management is accomplished by informing decision makers. And finally, just to return to this picture, I may be wrong, but in my experience and from reviewing ISO 31000, COSO, and other risk management frameworks, while I've seen the issue of risk ownership brought up, I have never seen this idea of informing every decision maker according to their ability to influence an overall level of risk. If you are aware of examples of that, I'd really like to hear from you. So, thank you for your attention.